Hello, it's Jack Tutor here of Attention Magazine. Welcome to Crucial Listening, the podcast where I speak with musicians and sound artists about 3 albums that are important to them. My guest this time is Jennifer Walshe, a composer, improviser, much else besides. She is presently Professor of Composition at Oxford University. Born in Dublin, Jennifer's work goes all over. There are many things that I could have discussed with Jennifer in the first 15 minutes of this conversation, where I generally ask about the guest's recent projects. We could have talked about the piece that she did for Chamber Ensemble, which centers on a musically trained space crew set to colonize Mars. We could have talked about her recent piece with John Lydecker. She did an essay for Unsound recently in their newsletter called 13 Ways of Looking at AI, Art and Music, which is refreshingly complicating. So there's a real sprawl to Jennifer's work as a whole, and each individual atom of that as well, each individual piece also splays in so many different directions. I mean, specifically for this conversation, we start by talking about her collaboration with Tony Conrad in the merry month of May, which is released on Blue Chopsticks, an affiliate label of Drag City. It's the last studio recording of the wonderful Tony Conrad. It's such a great set. The 2 musicians here, I mean, Jennifer and Tony have been collaborating for a long time, and I get the sense listening to this that they're having a lot of fun. There's something very loose-limbed about this music. The durations often run quite long. The improvisations musically just have this buoyancy to them. Just sounds like 2 people having a lot of fun, and yet they manage to pack a lot of quite convoluted emotional states into the music. We talk about, during this discussion, the kind of thread of darkness that sort of just sits underneath the surface that sometimes you need to double take in order to detect. It's such a good record. So please do check that out. Jennifer was awesome in conversation. No surprise, she picked 3 really eclectic records. It led to a wonderful chat. I'm grateful to her for her company. This was awesome. So if you're enjoying the podcast, thank you very much. You can support it over at Coffee, if you please, ko-fi.com/crucial listening. You can donate monthly or one-off, any amount you please, and that goes towards keeping the podcast ticking. You can rate it and review it. That's very nice too. Or you can just listen to it and enjoy it, for goodness sake. Do what you like. But thank you for your support as always. So, without any further blabber from me, this is Jennifer Walshe on Crucial Listening. Hello, Jen. Welcome to Crucial Listening.
Thanks very much for having me, Jack. Nice to talk to you.
Lovely to talk to you. You're here to talk about 3 important albums. Before we get to those, I want to talk about your new collaborative album with the late Tony Conrad in the merry month of May, which has just been released on Blue Chopsticks. So you were collaborating with Tony for a long while. At what point did the idea of a record arise, and why?
Well, I think the idea of a record was always there as something that we would do. In fact, we planned to do more than one record, but it was baked in because, like most free improvisers I've worked with, Tony and I recorded so much of what we did. If we could possibly be recording things, we always were, right from the very first time we jammed together. I got to know Tony because Gordon Monaghan has a festival, I hope he's still running it, in Meaford, Ontario, called Electric Eclectic. And I was invited to do a solo show there. I think it must have been about July 2008, something like that. And I went and I was playing, Loud Objects were playing, Tony was playing, there was a bunch of other people all playing, a bunch of people who had come up from New York. So there was some of the WFMU DJs had come up from New York. So like Fabio was DJing between some of the sets. And it was a completely bonkers festival. Gordon Monaghan's wife, Laura Kikaku, who's a fantastic artist, it was her family farm that was called the Funny Farm that the festival ran on. And so, it was very strange. There's almost no toilet, very few toilets. So I remember sharing a bathroom with Alexander Hacke from Einstürzen and Neubauten, and that Mary Margaret O'Hara was there as well. And the backstage area was a installation that Laura had made, which looked like a secondhand record shop and was full of the finest curated exotica, cheese, lounge music you could imagine. So everybody was just taking records from this sort of fake record shop and playing, Elvis sung in Flemish and things like that. So
Wow.
it felt like very much the perfect place to meet Tony. And when I was introduced to Tony at lunch, before we'd heard each other play, he just wanted to talk about Irish folk music and the rate of harmonic change and whether Irish folk music was really monophonic or polyphonic. So we just got straight into this very nerdy discussion about music theory and harmony and polyphony in Irish folk music. And then we decided, we should get together and play. And we discovered we were both living in the same neighborhood in Brooklyn, a neighborhood called Greenpoint. So we just started playing together, just jamming, trying things out. And so that was the start of it, to be honest. And we were documenting everything we did because we didn't know what we were going to do with it, but we wanted to keep it all. And then very sadly, in 2015, we found out that Tony's cancer, which had been in remission and then come back, we found out that it was terminal. And at that point, we said, okay, let's really do it. Let's go in a studio. We've so many recordings. It would be so easy to release a record from all the recordings that we have. But let's actually go in a studio because that's what Tony wanted to do near the end of his life. He wanted to work. That's what he wanted to do. He wanted to spend time with his friends and his loved ones and make more art until the very bitter end. And so we booked a studio with a fantastic sound engineer called Quentin Chiappetta. And I made several trips over to New York so that we could record everything. So that's sort of a long answer to your question, but I think that covers what happened.
Yeah, fabulous. And when you went into the studio, were you picking up pieces that you'd already recorded and doing them there, or was this an entirely fresh set of material that you hadn't done before?
This was entirely fresh. So we went in and we had so many musical instruments. It was insane. Like I remember each morning of the session when we were doing the original recordings, like the initial recordings, I just remember I had like an Airbnb in Brooklyn and I'd walk over to Tony's apartment and then we would just load up a cab with, a cello in a bin bag and, tins of beans, like so that we could open the beans and mulch them with our hands, and picture frames and auto harps and broken auto harps and all sorts of bits and pieces, a violin, a flute, Tony's long string instrument, which has to be assembled on site. And whenever I helped him assemble it, I came away with cuts on my hands because some of the metal on it wasn't filed down properly. But so we just sort of knew we just wanted to explore. If I can put it this way, I think of it as that we wanted to explore this specific territory that Tony and I explored together. Every improvisers, whether they're solo or they work with duo or trio or quartet configuration, I always think there's different territory you interrogate with different people. And like with Tony, with the duo, which to me is one of the most important formations in free improv. I really think that's where it's at, the duo for me. There's with different people, of course I'm still myself, but there's specific shadings or specific territories that are slightly different from person to person. And so with Tony and I, it was like we wanted to go into this territory that we knew had something to do with drone, but it also had something to do with folk music, and it also had something to do with text, and really was as thrown as wide open to the entirety of music history as it could possibly be. So when we went into the studio, we didn't know what we were going to do. We'd had a bunch of discussions. Tony had been reading a book about MP3, so he was sort of talking about compression and things like this in a very abstract sense. But we just went in and we played as much as we could. And then I took hours and hours and hours of sessions back to London, and I started to work it down to a long list, because I didn't want to put all the work on Tony because, he had a lot going on and medical appointments and everything. And then we went on to the short list, and then we worked in the studio, and then we were like producing everything. So it was a process of multiple meetings, which, despite the fact that we knew these were the last sessions, they were deeply joyous. They were deeply dark in many ways, but also deeply joyous.
Yeah. I want to also bring up Day of the Fair, because I've been on a bit of a journey with that, and I see it mentioned in a lot of reviews. So I'll be completely frank. In the first few acquaintances with this record, I would be like, fuck, Day of the Fair's coming up.
I don't blame you. And now you're like, the thing is, once you've heard it, it is toxic weapons grade earworm.
What happened with me was, this is a little while back. I was driving in the car with my son, and what I wanted to do when we were driving is check some masters that I'd done to ensure they played okay in the car. And he just started singing the sea shanty, the Wellerman, and changing the lyrics all the time for the entire car journey. I think partly in the knowledge that I wanted to also use that time to listen to masters. So there was this like antagonistic, but really sort of like high on his own fumes energy to it. And I was like, fuck, that feels like the Day at the Fair. To me, when I should
tell you that the extended version of it was about 40 minutes long. That was down,
Wow.
So, and really, like, I remember going to David Grubbs's apartment in New York after Tony had passed away, and I was left, like, the final session we had booked in the studio, I was left, it was me and Quentin by ourselves, and Tony was gone, and there was like grief, and it was very emotional. And I went over to David Grubbs's house to listen to the, the masters that we'd made. And I was like, is it too much? And he's like, no, it needs to be this long. It really does, because it's so relentless.
Yeah.
It's so utterly relentless. So, and I think it's interesting to me how people have reacted to that track. And there's been, like, I know Drew Daniel from Matmos emailed me, and he said, oh, there's some really dark stuff going on in this track.
Yeah.
And I said to him, well, I'm really glad that you get that, because as I was like, that really was improvised. Tony was mucking around on the auto harp, hitting it with a bow, and all his auto harps were not tuned like to standard equal temperament, and he was playing around with it. And I just felt like it had to be this manic folk song, but but also a folk song in the mode of like, something has gone horribly wrong. Like, there's a gun to your head as you're being forced to sing about going to the fair. And as I was singing it, and as I said, it went like, there's a really, really long take of just sort of finding out what it is. And as I was singing it, I had this memory that was from my childhood, which was that we lived in Amsterdam for a while when I was a kid, and we had some neighbors who were German, and they were very, very sweet, and they were elderly, and they sort of, me and my sister got a little bit, it was like having an extra set of grandparents, to some extent. These elderly neighbors, very, very sweet people. And my mother was friends with them, really, really, she loved them too. And I don't want to name their names, but the woman, she told my mother a story about when, she had been living in Germany at the end of World War II. And as the Russians were coming through, the Russians were often killing and raping, the inhabitants of the villages right at the very end of the war as they sort of came through the villages. And so she related to my mother how her village had decided that rather than risk being murdered, tortured, raped at the hands of the at the hands of the Russian forces, that they would drown themselves in the river. And that she remembered as a child walking to the river and seeing, understanding that they were going to drown themselves, but not really understanding it because she was a child. And as they reached, she could see people in the water and bodies floating in the water. But as they reached right to the edge of the river, the Russian forces came through and started pulling people out of the water, and it was clear that they were going straight through the village. They weren't going to stop there. And she told my mother this story. Of course, she didn't tell me when I was a child. And it wasn't until I was much older that my mother told me this story, and because it had really stuck, it had really
Yeah.
stuck in my mother's head. My mother's a writer, and it stuck in my head. And so as I was singing the day of the fair, I had this, this vision of people walking to the water. And so there's a section where I'm singing, my father's hand, it laid in mine. They pushed, her under the water. I ran and ran, my feet were fast. So I felt, I think that folk music is amazing because folk music tells some of the darkest, most bloody, most violent tales you possibly can. And it tries to tell them so that we can realize these things happen in the world and almost, expose ourselves to them in song, expose ourselves to them in folk song, so that like if we meet them in real life, we maybe have just even the starting point of how to deal with it. So
Yeah.
so for me, that sort of darkness, a lot of Irish folk songs are very dark, a lot of the Harry Smith Anthology of American Folk Music, which is a very beloved record of mine. That would have been one of the three I would have picked. A lot of it singing about suicide, like, abortion, babies dying, very, very dark topics. So for me, that's something that's very important with folk music. And in the day of the fair, I felt like, it was almost like Berlin Cabaret, going so dark, like so inane and so sort of demented that you could get at something really, really dark on the underbelly of that.
Yeah, absolutely. Gosh, that's incredible. Jennifer, thank you. We should move on to important records, but I want to implore everyone to check out In the Merry Month of May. Wow, it's been...
Check it out. You can always skip the day of the fair.
But don't. Honestly, go on that journey. You'll be a stronger, better person for it. So your important records, Jennifer. So one question I like to ask at this point is how you thought about the word important when picking your list of 3 records. So was there a way that you understood that term in order to come up with the records that you did?
Well, I tried not to overthink it, and I tried to think right now in May 2024, what are like 3 records that are important to me. And the Meredith Monk album, the Our Lady of Late, that sort of, it's not an album I listen to very much, but it's an album which is incredibly important to me because back in 1997, I was just 23 years old. I just turned 23, and my teacher, Amnon Volman, said, go listen to Meredith Monk, go to the library. And there was a sort of I had a series, I used to have a lesson a week. And over a series of 4 or 5 weeks, he said to me, one week he said, go listen to Meredith Monk. Then the next week was like Diamanda Galaz. The week after that was Laurie Anderson. And I had this hardcore exposure to all of these female performers who made their own work, who performed their own work, and all who use the voice in different ways. And at that stage, I wasn't a vocalist. I would never have described myself as a vocalist. That was all in a couple of years later. But by exposing me to these albums, it really blew my mind, because as soon as I started to listen to Our Lady of Late, that was the first CD I was able to pull from Meredith Monk. And when I realized everything on her is just her voice and this glass, I felt like this ultimate DIY power, where you just felt like you can do it. You don't need an orchestra. You don't need a string quartet. And you can just make your own universe out of a voice and a crystal glass, which is only used in a couple of movements of it. So that's why I picked Our Lady of Late, because it's a very important record to me for those reasons.
Yeah, okay, let's get into that one then. I mean, another thing with it, as you mentioned, it's just Meredith Monk and a glass.
Yeah.
It's such a tight, vivid concept. And, I hear you talk a lot about, conceptual art practice, and there's something so satisfying about this one. Do you think, was that in your system then, this allure towards conceptual art? And do you think just the cleanliness of or the purity of that concept was a reason why as well that it may have appealed?
It's interesting because I would never call this a conceptual artwork. To me, this is going back to basics. It's like MTV Unplugged. It's saying, what can you do with just a voice?
Right.
And that you can open a voice up and you can get the whole world out of it. Now, if I put on my hat, over 20 years later from first listening to this, I can say, yeah, and she's doing some stuff with unison with the glass that I can attach to the uilleann pipes drones, the drone pipes and the uilleann pipes, or the tambura, or like different traditions all over the world that we have where there's a unison, there's a sustained pitch with a voice singing on top of that. But what was really notable to me was like there isn't any clear text, but you hear all these different stories and people in the album
Yeah.
because of the way that she uses her voice. And that really was what blew my mind, because it was, listening to it, I felt like here's the voice without text, without, the classical music tradition. There's some fantastic vocal music, but the sort of the standard vocal setting of text didn't really click with me at that time. So to sort of just get rid of it and instead have all of these personae, like there's sections of it where it feels like it's like two old people talking to one another, or an older young people person talking to one another, and the richness of the color and how she used their voice. That was just, it felt like somebody saying, I'm going to make work out of bones, like out of the most basic human building blocks.
Yeah. That's an incredible ask as well from your teacher, to be like, go and explore this musician for like, what, a solid week or something, was it?
He used to do that. I loved it because it would just, he would just recommend somebody and say, off you go. I mean, I was a very nerdy student, so I was very happy to go to the library and listen to everything. I was delighted. And also, Amnon is still a person who's very dear to me. He has excellent taste. And I have to say, there was one point where we talked about this, like in the last few years, where I said to him, do you realize that right at the beginning, you said like Meredith Monk, Gloria Anderson, Diamanda Galaz, and he was like, I did immediately. Oh, I'm so glad, So I think he really, like Amnon's attitude, Amnon's gay, and he used to talk about the fact that like his job as a composition teacher was to get the students to come out of their aesthetic closets in the same way that you encourage, a closeted queer person to come out of the closet. And he used to say, like, most students, there's certain music that they want to make that they don't even know they want to make it, or they don't know they're allowed to make it, or, they need permission, or they need just to be shown you can do this if you want. And so you just sort of try to expose them to as much different music as possible, hoping that like one of those artists is going to hit that button that makes the person go, oh, I didn't realize that I can do this. And I now I know I've actually always wanted to do it. So certainly I think he, even though I wasn't even performing, he knew something about the voice. He knew something about like that sort of composer performer identity. And also, it's also pretty notable to me that up to that point in my education, I'd had male composition teachers. I'd even for a while had a female composition teacher. Nobody had ever told me to go and listen to music written by women. Nobody had ever recommended and said, you need to go away and listen to everything by this person. So, he did it without making a point of it. He just said, just go to listen to this. It's great. So, so when I was thinking, well, what's important? I thought that was a very important experience for me longitudinally in my life.
Yeah. And you mentioned this idea of kind of him drawing people out of their aesthetic closet. I wonder what that looked like for you at that time. So, I mean, can you kind of recall what you were going into this with in terms of like what may have constituted your closet that this was busting you out of?
I think certainly these, the different albums I listened to at this point, they planted the seeds for me only a couple of years later becoming a free improviser. Mm-hmm. Because when I came to free improv, I already sort of knew that's where I want to go. But also around this time, what it planted the seeds for was different ways of notating things, using the body, using movement, letting things be self-contained, and also thinking about notation in a different way. It was also really, really key because I had gone to, I had gone to what is now the Royal Scottish Conservatoire. And, when you study composition at an institution like that, especially if you study it in the mid to late 90s, everybody's writing down things, they're notating things in a standard way. And so in order to be able to to have very different sorts of ideas. You have to have different sorts of notation because it's, there's certain concepts that I can more easily express in Irish or German than I can in English because the words exist for it or the terms exist for it in those languages. And so with notation, you need different types of notation to allow you to explore different types of ideas or sonic relationships or textures or things like that.
With Meredith, I mean, this record was picked, it's the initiating one for you when, you were told to go and check out Meredith's work. Are there other records that you discovered as well that maybe would have been in the mix here or that are also particularly important to you by Meredith Monk?
I listen to everything else, I mean, I have to say two of the things that stuck for me is not even any other specific record, but it's just the fact that she did film and dance as well.
Yeah.
And so, like seeing this person, that it was a multidimensional practice, not just making music, but making films and performing herself, working with her own ensemble, and doing movement as well. All of that was deeply inspiring because and to this day, like whenever I see Meredith Monk perform or I see her interviewed, she looks happy, because she's like she's sort of very, very immersed in this world that she's created. And my music doesn't sound like hers. And there's a lot of things she does that are very tonal and very modal and very clean in a way that I could never do even if I tried. But that sort of sense of being completely immersed in your practice and it not just being the voice, being connected to your body and how your body moves, like that to me is very inspiring because that's what I aspire to in many ways. It's easy to just get stuck behind the laptop, but that's the way of making music that I'm happiest is when I'm like fully in my body doing it.
Mm-hmm. Have you seen her perform live?
Oh yeah, it was great. I sat up the front and totally stalked her. I was like, that's notation work. And what also was inspiring about that was she took out this rumpled piece of manuscript paper where she'd written notes on it. And she said, oh, this is a new piece. I haven't memorized it yet. And I thought, okay, this is really interesting. So she gradually eases into memorizing things, allows herself to perform stuff live, even with, like really rumpled bits of notation.
Wow.
And so I'm like, yeah, that's the process. You have to play live again and again and again to sort of understand that that's the right way to do it. And your audience trusts that's the right way to do it.
Yeah, that's like a comedian doing like a work in progress night or something.
Yeah, exactly.
It's so cool.
I mean, to be honest, if I could have very easily picked a comedy album because I'm very interested in that sort of process and what it means to be in the room. And I think that free improvisation and comedy share that very, very closely.
Yeah, for sure. Is there anything else you wanted to add about Meredith Monk?
No, I think we should probably move on, shouldn't we? Because it's half already.
Let's crack on. Jen, let's go for your second important album now.
Okay.
Which one do you want to pick?
We could talk about Voyager, I suppose, because I think that's a good one. And I suppose Voyager, again, is something that I think about it a lot. And the reason I picked it, the Voyager Golden Record, is when I was a kid, I was... we had the book of Carl Sagan's Cosmos, and I would look at the pictures in it. And then when I found out about the Voyager Golden Record, I found that a completely magical concept. I have a project called Ashtoch, which is an ongoing project which claims to be the archive of Irish avant-garde art and music. And one of the identities that's part of Ashtoch, I'll talk about him as if he's real, but he's fake, is Caoimhín Brannach. And I claim that Caoimhín Brannach was my great uncle, and he was an outsider artist and cassette tape obsessive. And for the Golden Record, for the Voyager Golden Record, the anniversary of it in 2017, I was commissioned by Galway Art Centre to make something, and I made Caoimhín Brannach's golden cassette, which has engraved into the body of the cassette some of the figures that are engraved into the golden record on the
Oh, so
Voyager
cool.
probe. And I'm working at the moment. I've been working on a lot of pieces to do with Mars. So one of the recordings I have on my laptop, which I listen to a lot, is this 4-hour recording of that Voyager made as it passed by Jupiter. So I'm sort of deep in the space lore for this. But I think Voyager is a very interesting idea. It's also a really weird record,
Yeah.
which is bad. I'm sorry, Carl Sagan. I love you, but this is very badly curated. And I'm very sorry, Carl, because like you're up in heaven right now, and like one of the stars will go out for me tonight because I just insulted Voyager. But I think it's worth talking about. It has some fantastic music on it, and the idea behind it of making this record that we send out into the cosmos is really beautiful. But it's also a record which overwhelmingly has music by men
Yeah,
written on.
yeah. Yeah.
And I know they've really tried, to have music from a wide variety of countries all over the world, and there's some great, fantastic music from all over the world on it. But it's something that my understanding is that it was quite rushed. They sort of decided to add it, and so it wasn't like they spent several years thinking about this and going to every curator all over the world. So I enjoy listening to it as a very strange sort of compilation of what we consider humanity to be.
Yeah.
What also I
Yes.
think is super notable about it. I mean, it's great that there's some Stravinsky on there because at least, they included a bit of more contemporary music. But there's so much music missing from there. And then on top of that, there's, there's this overrepresentation of Bach, as if
Yeah.
Bach is somehow the pinnacle of human experience, the
Yeah.
only music that can possibly express, like our innate sense of being. And so for me, it's a very interesting album to look at for all these reasons, because you see all of these biases, you see the problems of making a compilation at all. To begin with, you see the good things that they tried to do. You see the strange things that they did. So for me, it's quite a fascinating artifact more than anything else.
Yeah, yeah. The Bach thing is weird because I listened to a little podcast where they talked about the fact that Bach deploys certain mathematical principles within composition that they thought may be potentially more salient to like whatever life form was picking this up. But surely there's got to be other options than doing how much. It's like at least two Bach pieces on here.
There's
Right?
lots of stuff, and I
Gosh.
really think like you have this obsession with Bach, which happens amongst mathematicians, because then you can say
Mm-hmm.
that music is right, quote unquote,
Yeah,
right.
yeah,
Because it employs mathematical, different mathematical features within it. But like really, all music employs mathematics because
yeah,
the
for
octave
sure.
is a 2-to-1 relationship. And if it's music that comes from cultures where they're working in just intonation, there's a lot of maths going on there in just intonation relationships and pure number relationships.
Yeah,
um and I think that like I work a lot with AI, and there's Bach is this sort of touchstone that a lot of computer scientists who are into music start by trying to replicate Bach. And it's a neat little data set is the other thing. Like you can take all of these, organ chorales. So you have a nice little data set that's consistent. It's all in the public domain, so it's easy to work with. So I just made a radio show for WDR in Germany about this essay I wrote last year called 13 Ways of Looking at AI, Art and Music. And for the section called The Ineffable, it was so easy to get so many different AI generated versions of Bach because of this obsession with Bach.
wow.
It's this sort of common theme that that computer scientists go back to again and again, and there's like there was a Google Doodle, that where you could use AI to compose a little bit of Bach. And you've got these interviews with, different computer scientists and researchers who work at Google, and they're all saying, Bach is a genius and it's perfect. And so this myth of like, what is a genius? What is perfect?
Yeah.
Is music more perfect because we claim that it has a better demonstration of mathematical principles than other pieces of music? What does that even mean?
Yeah,
Like if we
100%.
really wanted that, should we not have just sent like a sine tone album?
Right.
that had very
Yeah.
specific numerical relationships. So the Voyager, for me, it's a very interesting, it is in many ways, it's a conceptual art record first, even though nobody would have claimed it was a conceptual art record.
Yeah, for sure. What was on the golden cassette?
The golden cassette was, I claim, Queeveen Brannock's recordings that he felt could heal you, or that could realign parts of your system. So some of the tracks on there are supposed to be quite instrumental. I mean, in the sense of like they're supposed to be usable, like the same way that people might use caffeine or marijuana to mood regulate. Instead, you could listen to these tracks which would regulate your energies and things like that. There's also a synth composition I wrote on an ARP in 1996. So there's a whole bunch of different stuff on there. Yeah.
Oh, that's great. I also love that it's tape because there's something so heartbreaking about that. I guess this golden record was specifically designed in order to withstand, the duration it's going to be flying through space, whereas with a tape, that's just fated to perish. But if you've got someone who's obsessed with tape, I guess that's going to be where they're going to go, which is lovely.
Tape to me is fascinating because when I was very small, the only way to listen to music was either on the radio, on vinyl, or on cassette. That was it. There was no other modality that you had. And the only one of those that you had as a small child any sort of power over was cassette, because you could record things onto a cassette and you could delete them. And you couldn't do that on vinyl. Vinyl was just a standalone product. And so tape has been very, 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 very important to me since I was a kid for that reason, because it felt like a little bit of autonomy. And when I was about 7 years old, I'm Irish, and so I would not describe myself as a religious person, and I definitely would not describe myself as a Catholic. But as a child, I made my first Holy Communion, which is this standard rite that you take at the age of usually about 7 in the Catholic Church. And generally when kids take their first Holy Communion, everybody gives them a bit of cash, and it's the first time in their life they ever have cash. Because everybody gives them a little bit of money to mark their first Holy Communion. So I saved up all my money from my first Holy Communion and I bought a cassette recorder. And so, and I really felt like I had purchased a piece of technology which enabled me to record sounds and play them back. And so it gave me this tremendous sense of power as a child. And so I still have that exact same cassette recorder, and it still works.
No
which is more than I can say for my iPod from 2000. So sort of it's this idea of cassettes as fetish objects, as when you find a cassette that you haven't been able to find, it's a very emotional, beautiful feeling to finally track down some cassette that has some set of recordings on it. So definitely Queeveen Brannock's obsessiveness with cassette tapes. He has a lot of my original cassette tapes from when I
Wow. Oh, so you've got some of those old tapes as well that you were recording when you were a kid.
Yeah, I have my quote unquote radio shows from when I was a little kid. And I also just have stuff I recorded off the radio and, things like that. But I have these really old cassettes. My father worked for IBM, and they would have, instructional cassettes that would sort of teach them new code, and he would bring them home, and then I would just record over them and record my stuff on them.
Wow. Oh, that's great. Jen, anything else you wanted to say about Voyager Golden Record before we go to the final one?
No, I mean, I highly recommend listening to it, just because it's a very interesting experience and it's a beautiful idea. But I suppose it shows the absolute futility in trying to represent an entire world in just a couple of hours of music. How ridiculously difficult that's going to be.
One thing, actually, I couldn't get a sense of this. There's a section, I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, where it's a bunch of greetings in different languages that then transits. So whale song starts to fade up during the greetings until whale song is all you can hear.
And I mean, I understand that, in that they're trying to think about different forms of language. Right, yeah. And it's also the 70s, so people are into whale song. They think it's a fun thing to listen to chill out. And I mean, what's really fascinating to me is just thinking about the idea of language, because when you listen to all these greetings in these different languages, it's almost like it's a shot in the dark, hoping that one of these might be what the aliens speak.
Yeah, yeah.
So it makes sense to fade the whales out, because what the hell? It's much more likely it's going to be whale song, because because the 55 languages of Earth are all human languages, whereas
Yes,
there's
yeah.
millions of species in Earth that all have their own different languages. So I'm a big Ted Chiang fan, and he wrote the
Mm.
story that the movie Arrival is based on, where he talks about like completely different types of alien language that restructure the way that you perceive time. So I'm much more on the Ted Chiang end of things. So the whale song actually makes the most sense to me, whereas I don't need to hear the Austrian version of German and the Swiss version of German. I need like different whales or dolphins.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense, because I guess the fading up sort of allows potentially the other life form to be like there's an equivalence being drawn between human language and the whale song. Like this is trying to get the same thing.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Except we don't have any bird, we don't have like
Yeah.
extended bird tracks.
Dataprogrammerare i den lilla universitetsstaden Ithaca på planeten Jorden.
Mwibanji mwantu wonse wa kumwamba.
પૃથ્વી ઉપર વસનાર એક માનવ તરફથી બ્રહ્માંડના અન્ય અવકાશમાં વસનારાઓને હાર્દિક અભિનંદન. આ સંદેશો મળે વળતો સંદેશો મોકલાવશો.
Пересилаємо привіт із нашого світу, бажаємо щастя, здоров'я і многоя літа.
درود بر ساکنین ماورای آسمان ها. بنی آدم اعضای یک پیکرند که در آفرینش ز یک گوهرند. چو عضوی به درد آورد روزگار، دگر عضوها را نماند قرار.
Okay, Jen, one more important record. So again, if you could tell me the name of it and then a little bit about why it's important to you.
Well, The Lexicon of Love by ABC is an album which I didn't get into it until about, I would say, 7 or 8 years ago.
Oh, wow.
And now I'm obsessed with this, and I probably listen to it. It's also the album that almost every single time I travel, when I land, it's the album that I play when I land. And so it's an album that I also associate with being in every country you can think of, walking through the air. But I absolutely love it. And so, of course, when I was a kid, I would have heard The Look of Love on the radio growing up. And I thought it was a great, fun song, super campy, very, very over the top. But I've spent so much time with this album over the last years that it gets richer and richer each time you listen to it. There's more and more detail. You start to hear all these strange little connections between the songs, where it's quite often that you'll have this high point in the song where Martin Fry will sort of like speak something very earnestly, and then there'll be this like drum riff which happens immediately after it. It's all about love, but you don't even know if he actually really loves people, because he feels so alone in the course of the album, the way that he sings. There's all these strange things going on. Like there's songs that begin one way and then an orchestra drops in. Like, so a lot of the time you'll hear a song begin to start and then you go, oh, this sounds really naff and cheesy. And then you're like, oh, of course, I've forgotten that this is the one with the amazing orchestra bit that comes in. So it's this album that I never tire of listening to. And it for me, the sort of the performance style, this sort of high drama, high camp, absolute commitment. Is it ironic? Who knows? Who cares? I don't listen to this ironically, certainly not. That to me is something that it's like a richly flavored drink that I need to drink regularly to keep, my electrolytes in balance.
How did you discover it?
I think because I'm trying to think, was it 2017 or 2016 or even 2015? I think it was 2017 that I went really crazy over it. And I think there was a summer where I think I listened to it 4 or 5 times every single day.
Wow.
And it was because I was in my house in Ireland and I needed to completely clean the house out, to sort things out. So, you put on an album in the background and then you're like, oh, I'll just listen to it again and again and again. But I think maybe part of it also was like, my friend Stephen Swift, who was a fantastic actor, and he was also a collaborator of mine, and he's passed away very, very sadly. He passed away in 2018. And I think that we had been talking about like music, high camp music from the 80s. And he had said to me, but the whole album is great. It's not just the look of love. And I had thought, like, I'll give it a shot because, like I was born in the 70s. So there's songs I know from the 80s, but I don't know them that well because I wasn't old enough yet to like buy the albums. I was just old enough to know the songs from the radio. And because there was no streaming, you really just did get served what was on the radio. And, I had no money when I was a kid. And so, I would buy cassettes, and then of course I would buy CDs, but a great deal of the music that I did get was from the radio, and we were constantly recording things off the radio to make like compilation cassettes of songs we'd recorded off the radio. And so you didn't get to hear all of the rest of an album unless, for some bizarre reason, Dave Fanning or John Peel chose to play it. So, I do find myself it's quite an interesting experience as I get older. Every now and then you'll remember an album or you'll remember a song from when you were a teenager or even younger than that and think, I'm going to go and I'm going to listen to the whole album that this was on just out of curiosity. Just to see what the whole thing sounded like, because I didn't hear it at the time. So that was part of it, was Stephen saying like, oh, you should hear the whole album, The Lexicon of Love. It's really, really good. I think that was probably it. And I hope that was what pointed it to me, because he was a very, very dear friend, and it was really rough on all of us who loved him very much, losing him. So I know he would be delighted to think that he pushed me to listen to The Lexicon of Love 4 to 5 times a day for a month in the summer.
Wow. Okay, so this is the first time I've listened to it all the way through. I had a wonderful time with it. I think All of My Heart came on, and I was like, oh shit, I'm going to need to go back to this one a fair bit. Something about the chord progressions and the tempo of that one, which really chimes with my inner soul.
Yep.
What is do you have a favorite track? Does it change? Yeah, what's your relationship like with favorite tracks?
It changes all the time. Of course, The Look of Love is amazing, but Many Happy Returns, which is not a song that I ever thought I would love when I first heard the opening. You know what I mean? The opening of it. Yeah. But I love that. I love Poison Arrow. And I think what the thing is that I think for me, if I were to take like Martin Fry as like artistically, not biologically, and Meredith Monk, and I were to merge them, that would be probably the art that I make. It's those two things, it's sort of like the high camp, the pop, the staring into your eyes performativity, that the energy is blasting out into the space. All of that sort of stuff I love, and I find it really cathartic when I listen to it. I would never listen to The Lexicon of Love if I wanted to have a good cry. If I was really, really sad, I would listen to my Vashti Bunyan or my Joni Mitchell, or my Arvo Pärt, and I'd bawl my eyes out and have that real grief catharsis. But in terms of just this unbelievably vibrant, colourful music full of life, that's what I listen to The Lexicon of Love for.
Love it. I mean, tell me though, because this being my early acquaintance, it feels like that there's and you've mentioned this already, in fact, but there is like an undercutting sadness, even aesthetically, not just lyrically, but there's something which I wonder if this is part of its longevity, is this kind of tension there where it's funky, but it's kind of sad funky. It's kind of a dance that you're doing.
It's maybe not like party elevate. Music. It's not party music, I suppose. And of course, because one of my favorite things about the album is like the spoken passages. Right. I said to myself, Martin, he talks to himself, and I love it. But there is this sort of pain, but he's not singing in an emo way about pain. So it's sort of I suppose in a way it's sort of taken for granted that there is pain. And that still you make this really vibrant music despite all that alongside it. Do you know what I mean?
Oh, 100%. Yeah, that almost feels like played out in the opening moments of the record, where you have those lush, very kind of despondent strings, and then it switches straight up into like a really good bass line. This is great. Indeed. I love it. So how often do you listen to it now?
I would probably say maybe once a week or once every
Still good going.
It's still there. I don't know. There's something about it that feels very. I'm wondering about like when will the point, when I'm like, no, I don't need to listen to that again. But and it's also, I have to say, it's pre-pandemic. My partner and I, every now and then, we would, if we were both like stressed out of our minds, we would go to Soho and go to like Lucky Voice or one of these karaoke places where you rent the private rooms. It's the booths that you rent. So and it was almost like the way people are like, oh, my back's really out, I need to go to the chiropractor, or like have an hour of massage. We were like, let's just go to Lucky Voice for an hour and just sing really violently, and then we'll both be like far more relaxed when we leave Lucky Voice. And so we would go in there, and I'd always be like, they don't have enough ABC on this system. I need more ABC. I need some deep cuts. So every now and then, not only will I listen to it, but every now and then, if I'm working in the studio by myself and I'm just like, just a bit, frazzled, I will pull up a karaoke version of one of the tracks from this album on YouTube and just sing it by myself. And then I'm like, right, I feel better now. I can then
amazing.
Pound another 50 emails about like compliance to data regulations at the university I teach at or whatever.
That is so incredible.
Yep.
Any other of their records that chime for you as well?
I've not listened to any else of them because
Wow.
The Lexicon of Love. See, that's the thing. The Lexicon of Love has given me everything I need, and which makes me now I feel disgraceful, and now I will go and listen to another album by Lexicon of Love. But guys, seriously, like I'm looking at the Spotify play, 30 million plays for Poison Arrow, 88 million plays for Look of Love. I don't listen to it on Spotify, so I can't say that my numbers contributed, but I can sort of see that this album is more popular than anything they've ever made.
Yeah, well, they did a sequel to this album in 2016, I think.
Really?
Yeah.
I did hear at one point they did a live version.
Okay.
So I will go and listen to. That's what I will do. I will go and listen to the Lexicon of Love too.
Yeah. All the
Finally.
best for that.
Dreams fall apart at the seams. Your reason for living, your reason for leaving. Don't ask me what it means. I don't know the answer to that question. If I knew, I would tell you. Look for your information. Is this one thing, the one thing that still holds true? What's that?
Okay, Jen, I've got one more question for you, which relates to how music comes into your life as a listener, as someone who buys music. Like, where do you tend to, or where and how do you tend to consume your music, for want of a better word? And yeah, tell me a bit about that.
Well, I think this is a super interesting conversation because, if you'd asked me, say, 25 years ago, I would say, well, I've got my Discman, and then I've got like some sort of setup where I can listen to stuff in my room. Whereas now there's so many different ways you can consume it and in so many different formats. So I listen to different things depending on if I'm in a car and I'm driving, I'll listen to certain things. Whereas if I'm, walking, I'll listen to certain things. I'll listen to it on certain platforms depending on the different contexts that I'm in. So I do love radio. And so when I'm in the car, I really, really enjoy, if I'm driving around London, I really enjoy scanning all the local radio stations, and I especially love listening to like the small pirate stations and the small independently run stations and things like that. Sometimes I will, I'll listen to loads of different radio stations online, and I'll often listen to WFMU, which is quite strange because I'm usually listening to like the 3 o'clock in the morning set when I'm waking up at 8, and it's a very different vibe that I'm in. But it's because they're in New York. But so I'll listen to lots of different radio stations, and I also really like listening to my friend John Leidecker. He does stuff. He does this. I think they've been going for 3 decades. This program called Over the Edge, which is this 3-hour long, radio mixage thing with Negative Land, and they do that bi-weekly, and that's on Apple Podcasts. So I'll also listen to that. So I do like to listen to radio just to sort of have this sense of of how radio functions. And of course, I listen to a lot of albums. I love Bandcamp. Bandcamp's fantastic. It pays artists, and I'm very happy to buy music on Bandcamp because I know the money's going to go through to the artists. I find myself less inclined now to buy physical products from Bandcamp, just simply because I'm like, if I buy the album, then the artists just get the money. They don't have to worry about posting anything.
Yes, yeah.
And I don't have to find a storage space, for anything. So I'm quite happy to buy stuff online. And I teach music, so Spotify, as Alex Ross says, it's a necessary evil. We need to use it because to be able to make playlists for my students of lots of different music for them to learn from. It's really easy, but I am wary of the fact that like very little of that money is going to the artists. Those subscription fees that I might pay each month, very little of that goes to the artists. And of course, like most musicians, whenever I see my friends, we all do a merch exchange where we are handing over the physical products from our latest publication to one another and swapping them around the place. So there's all that. And I suppose the last thing would be, I love secondhand shops. I love rooting around to see what I can find in a bargain bin or a weird secondhand vinyl. Like I've got some fantastic knitting records that are, just sort of people reading knitting patterns aloud to you as you knit.
No way.
That, yeah.
Wow. Do you, are you someone who, if you're, say, on tour, if you're in a different country, you'll go check out the secondhand shops and see?
Oh, yeah, of
what they got?
course. The secondhand shop is always where it's at.
Yeah.
You always check out the secondhand shops for records or for just weird stuff or clothing, things like that. But yeah, you can get some fantastic stuff in secondhand shops.
100%. Well, Jem, thank you so much. This has been great. I've loved the 3 records that you picked. As I said, I adore the collaboration with Tony too in the merry month of May. People do check that out. Thank you so much.
Thanks a million, Jack. And please, if your son ever sings a version of the Wellerman again with his own text, like please record it and send it to me because I'll deeply, deeply enjoy listening to that.
You got it. It's happening. Okay.
Thanks
awesome.
for having me, Jack. Take it easy.
Thank you. Cheers.
Bye.
Bye-bye.